by my troth! What is this abomination?
You think you know Queen Elizabeth I, the glorious Virgin Queen, the woman who ruled England for 45 years with grace, intelligence, and unshakable strength, the saviour of Protestant England, the slayer of the Spanish Armada, the patron of Shakespeare and the arts. That's the version you read in school. That's the fairy tale carefully preserved in golden portraits and sanitized documentaries. But behind the velvet curtains of power, behind the white lead mask and the jeweled gowns, it was a different queen, entirely a woman forged not in triumph, but in trauma, a ruler so obsessed with loyalty, so terrified of love, and so consumed by control that she turned her entire court into a prison, where affection was outlawed, beauty was a lie, and trust was punished, like treason. This was not just a monarch. This was a woman who weaponized heartbreak, who buried her vulnerability beneath iron rules, and who crushed anyone who dared to feel what she could not allow herself to feel. And if you think this sounds like fiction, wait until you hear what she did to the people who dared to love. Elizabeth Tudor was crowned in 1558. But her reign began long before that, on the day she watched her father, King Henry VIII, execute her mother, Anne Boleyn. She was barely 3 years old, but the trauma carved something deep into her. That day, she didn't just lose her mother, she lost her ability to believe that love was safe. As she grew, she learned to smile through suspicion, to speak through silence, and to hold herself apart, always apart. So when she became queen, she didn't rule with a heart open to love, she ruled with a fist clenched around fear.
My queen, you must reconsider.
I have considered it, Robert.
And nowhere did that fear manifest more brutally than in the laws she made around marriage and affection. To the outside world, Elizabeth was the ultimate single woman. The queen who needed no king, the sovereign who married her country instead of a man. But inside the walls of her court, her singleness was not just a choice. It was an obsession, a religion, a doctrine of loneliness that she imposed on everyone around her. Marriage, in her court, was not sacred. It was dangerous. It was an act of rebellion, a threat to her supremacy, a reminder that someone else might possess the intimacy she herself had been denied. And so, she made it clear no one was to marry without her explicit permission, not her ladies-in-waiting, not her courtiers, not her closest companions, not even those who had served her with unwavering loyalty. One of the most haunting examples of this rule was the story of Bess Throckmorton and Sir Walter Raleigh. Bess was one of Elizabeth's most trusted ladies-in-waiting, a woman who had dedicated her youth, her time, and her service to the Queen. Walter Raleigh was one of England's most dashing explorers, a favourite of Elizabeth's court, and a man with ambitions as vast as the oceans he sailed. In secret, away from the watchful eyes of spies and servants, the two fell in love. They whispered vows, exchanged promises, and, in 1591, they dared to do the unthinkable. They married without the Queen's blessing. But secrets do not stay buried for long in a court ruled by paranoia. When Elizabeth discovered their betrayal, her response was not disappointment, it was fury. Not sadness, but wrath. She did not simply dismiss them from court. She imprisoned them. She had them thrown into the Tower of London. That cold, rat-infested fortress of stone and despair. And Bess was pregnant. Elizabeth, the queen who preached grace and godliness, locked a pregnant woman in a freezing cell to make a point, to remind the world that love, when not authorized by her, was a punishable sin, that even the beginnings of a family, something Elizabeth herself had been denied, could be grounds for shame and exile. Bess would spend months behind bars, alone and afraid, separated from her husband, unsure if she or her unborn child would ever breathe the free air again. But the punishment did not end with the tower. Even after they were released, Elizabeth ensured that Bess would never return to court. Raleigh eventually crawled back into the Queen's good graces, charming his way into royal favour once more. But Bess was banished for life. She had served Elizabeth faithfully for years, but one act of personal happiness erased everything. Her crime was love. Her sentence was erasure, and Elizabeth made sure it stayed that way. Historians today might call this trauma. Psychologists would whisper about attachment disorders, abandonment wounds, narcissistic patterns of control. But in the 16th century, there was no language for these things. There was only royalty. There was only power. And Elizabeth used her power not only to rule a nation, but to dominate the emotional lives of everyone around her. To build a world where no one could love without fear, where the scent of romance carried the risk of disgrace, where affection itself became a dangerous, subversive act. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a law, a climate of suspicion that poisoned every interaction in her court. Elizabeth didn't just prohibit marriages. She installed spies to report on flirtations, to document glances, to monitor the tone of every conversation between man and woman. Her court became a surveillance state where intimacy was currency and affection was contraband. Women walked the halls afraid to laugh too long in a man's presence, to accept a gift, to be seen standing too close, because the Queen was always watching, and the price of disobedience was always cruel. This is the truth they don't teach you in school. The truth buried beneath the gold frame of her portraits, and the legends of her greatness, that Elizabeth I, for all her brilliance and strength, ruled not only with policy but with psychological terror, that she did not just wear the crown, she weaponized it, and in doing so, she turned one of history's most glittering courts into a cold, controlled, and crushing place, where love was not celebrated, but feared, where happiness was dangerous, and where the greatest crime a woman could commit was to follow her heart. And this is just the beginning. It began, as all forbidden things do, not with rebellion, but with a whisper, an almost imperceptible glance exchanged between two people who, in another time and place, might have been free to love each other in the open, under sunlight instead of shadow. But in the court of Elizabeth Tudor, even affection had to wear a disguise. Even love had to learn how to lie. And so when Bess Throckmorton first met Sir Walter Raleigh, there was no fanfare, no announcement of destiny, only the soft hush of recognition between two souls who found in each other a brief sanctuary from the suffocating grip of a queen who demanded not only loyalty, but loneliness. Bess was no stranger to sacrifice. She had given her youth to the royal court, surrendered her privacy, her future, even the rhythm of her days to the ever-changing moods of a woman who ruled not merely with a crown, but with a silent and relentless hunger to be everything to everyone, and to be the only thing they ever needed. And in that cold palace of rules and rehearsals, Bess had learned to smile without feeling, to stand without swaying, to wait without aging. But Raleigh was different. Wild-eyed and sun-warmed, from distant voyages, a man who had faced oceans, storms, and undiscovered lands, and yet could be undone by the quiet strength in her gaze. They fell in love. Of course, not with the dramatic declarations of stage plays or the foolish impulsiveness of common romances, but with the slow ache of people who knew they were being watched, who had to fold every emotion into layers of restraint, who could not speak plainly, who could not touch without risk, who had to build an entire world in coded glances and stolen words, and in that hidden world, Bess was not merely a lady in waiting. And Raleigh was not just a courtier. They were simply two hearts reaching for each other in a palace that punished tenderness. They married in secret because secrecy was the only way love could survive. Under Elizabeth's reign, a reign where marriage was not a union but a rebellion, where every vow whispered without royal permission was treated as treason, where the heart was not a vessel of joy, but a liability to be regulated. And so Bess and Raleigh pledged themselves to each other quietly, privately, away from the perfumed corridors and golden ceilings, hoping perhaps foolishly that their devotion might be enough to shield them from the inevitable storm that would follow. It was not. When the Queen found out, her fury was not the fury of a ruler betrayed by politics. It was the fury of a woman betrayed by the very existence of intimacy she herself had chosen to forego. A fury rooted, not in reason, but in a deep and personal wound, the kind that festers beneath decades of powdered lies and painted smiles. And so Elizabeth did what she did best. She turned emotion into punishment, and love into a crime, and she sent them man and wife, barely bound, not even able to celebrate the beginning of their life together, into the Tower of London. The Tower was not just a prison. It was a message, a cold, damp cathedral of silence, where stone whispered of the condemned, and where the ghosts of political enemies mingled with the quiet cries of those who had simply loved the wrong person at the wrong time. And Bess, carrying a child, was locked behind those walls, her breath visible in the cold, her hands pressed to her belly, not in joy but in dread, wondering whether she would give birth behind iron doors, wondering if her child would ever see sunlight, if Raleigh's voice would ever again be more than a memory through stone. Raleigh, for his part, endured captivity in a different way, not because the Tower was kinder to men, but because he had always been a man who knew how to wait, how to scheme, how to charm. He knew that time could be bent, that even royal fury could cool, that if he survived long enough, the Queen's wrath might shift, as it so often did, into indulgence. But Bess had no such luxury, no such manoeuvring room. Her crime was not only marriage, it was motherhood. And Elizabeth had never forgiven women for the things she herself had refused. Months passed. Cold seasons folded into one another like mourning veils. And when release came, it did not come with apology or absolution, only with a colder punishment, the kind that appears merciful on the surface but rots from within. Bess was banished from court, erased from the golden tapestry she had once helped hold together with silence and discipline and patience, she was told, in no uncertain terms, that she would never stand near the Queen again, never serve again, never be welcomed again into the only world she had ever known. And while Raleigh eventually crept back into the Queen's favour, trading penance for poetry and navigating the Queen's moods like a familiar sea, Bess was cast out. Forgotten by the woman who had once called her loyal, once trusted her, once looked into her face and seen an echo of youth and safety. She had chosen love, and for that, she was erased. It is easy, now, to see this as cruelty, to call Elizabeth jealous, possessive, controlling. It is tempting to simplify her, to paint her in black and white. The Virgin Queen who outlawed marriage because she could not bear the reminder of all she had lost, who tore down others' happiness because she could never risk her own. But the truth is more complicated, more human, and therefore more tragic. Elizabeth was not merely cruel, she was afraid. Afraid of being replaced, afraid of being forgotten, afraid that any love shared by others might shine a light on the cavern of her own loneliness. I'm afraid that marriage so final, So absolute might be the one thing she could never dominate, never rewrite, never make entirely her own. And so she shattered it in others before it could take root. She tore it out of her court like a weed, convinced that if no one else could have it, it would cease to exist. But it did exist. In the quiet defiance of Bess and Raleigh, in the brave softness of a whispered vow, in the unborn child who survived the tower, love survived the Queen's wrath, but not without scars. And even now, centuries later, you can still hear it echoing through the halls of palaces where no one was allowed to fall in love, where weddings were whispered like conspiracies, where joy had to wear a mask, and affection had to apologize for its existence. This was the court of Elizabeth I, not merely a place of power and pageantry, but a theatre of emotional control, where love was chained, punished, and exiled not because it was dangerous, but because it dared to bloom in a place where fear was the only flower the Queen ever watered. By the time the kingdom came to know her, by the time painters across England etched her image in gold and vermilion, by the time foreign ambassadors wrote home in awe of her presence, Elizabeth Tudor had already chosen her second skin. It was not cloth, not silk, not armour. It was a mixture of white lead and vinegar, and she wore it like a veil over pain, like a shroud over memory. The world remembers her face pale as frost, unmoving as marble, radiant like the moon. But what no one was meant to remember, what no one was meant to know, was what lay beneath. It began in the year 1562. Elizabeth was 29, young by most standards, still early in her reign, but already burdened by the weight of a kingdom's gaze. She had ruled for 4 years, and was just learning how lonely a throne can feel when the only other person at the top is you. And then came the fever, the sweats, the shaking, the disfigurement. The smallpox came like a storm in the night, and when it left her, it left its marks, a constellation of scars across her cheeks, her forehead, her chin, each one a reminder that even a queen could be touched by something invisible and cruel. She survived, but the illness had done more than damage her skin. It had wounded her illusion. In a court where beauty was mistaken for divinity and flawlessness equated to favour from heaven, a scarred queen was a political problem. A woman with pockmarks on her face could not be the untouched virgin queen of English propaganda. She could not be Gloriana. She could not be Britannia. And so, Elizabeth did what she always did. When something threatened to expose her vulnerability, she buried it. The concoction she turned to was called Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic favoured by the nobility, made of white lead and vinegar, thick as cream, deadly as arsenic. It promised purity. It promised perfection. It promised to erase the past from the canvas of a woman's face. And for Elizabeth, it did something more. It gave her power over perception. With each layer, she could rebuild herself. With each coat, she could silence the whisper of illness. She could pretend, at least for a few hours, that she had not been touched by death. But it came with a cost. The leads seeped into her skin slowly. Like regret, it poisoned her blood. It wore down her teeth. It stole her hair. And as the damage mounted beneath the surface, she responded with more powder. Thicker layers. Heavier coats until what had once been makeup became a mask. A wall. A monument to denial. And still, she smiled. Every morning, her attendants would gather to perform what was no longer a beauty ritual, but a rite of concealment. They would smooth the paste across her cheeks and forehead, hiding the marks, the damage, the years. They would draw sharp eyebrows to mimic youth, rouge her lips to mimic vitality, place wigs upon her head to mimic the woman she used to be. And all the while, Elizabeth sat silent, watching herself become a painting, one brushstroke at a time. She wore hundreds of wigs over the years, red wigs to match the fire of her youth, curled wigs to suggest playfulness, towering wigs to impose authority. But they weren't just fashion, they were armor. Because underneath the velvet and the gold, beneath the lacquered curls and jeweled pins, her scalp was bare, nearly bald, eaten away by the very lead she used to preserve her image. The price of beauty was herself, and she paid it willingly. But what made it more tragic, more disturbing, more quietly cruel, was that she demanded the same of others. Elizabeth's court did not merely admire her choices, they were expected to imitate them. Her ladies-in-waiting, those soft-voiced women who lived and breathed in her presence, were not allowed to age freely, to wither gracefully, to carry the marks of their humanity with pride. No, they too were asked to coat their faces in white. They too were expected to bleach away the years, to poison their skin in service of aesthetic, to suffer in silence for the sake of symmetry. They followed her lead, some willingly, others because there was no other choice. In the court of Elizabeth, appearance was currency, and to fall out of visual favour was to risk banishment. The Queen's face was the standard, and anything less than that frozen perfection was considered disloyal. And so, day by day, the women closest to her began to vanish beneath their own masks, until the entire court became a theatre of powdered ghosts. But no one suffered more than the Queen herself. Because as the years passed, the scars from the illness were no longer the only things she was hiding. There were new marks, wounds caused not by disease but by the makeup itself. The lead cracked her skin, causing open sores, inflammation, discoloration. And as her body weakened, her devotion to the illusion only strengthened. She doubled down. She wore heavier foundation. She kept her chambers darker. She refused to allow anyone to see her without the mask. There are accounts hushed, whispered, never officially recorded, of ambassadors who were shocked upon meeting her, of foreign dignitaries who recoiled at the sight of a woman whose face no longer moved, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, whose cheeks were padded with cloth to hide the hollows left by lost teeth. And yet, the image endured, because Elizabeth made sure it did. She had portraits made, dozens of them, each one filtered through a strict system of censorship. Artists were not allowed to paint her as they saw her. They were given face patterns, official templates, blueprints for beauty, handed down by royal decree. If a painter strayed from the model, if they dared to capture the truth of her age or appearance, the portrait would be destroyed, and the artist might find themselves punished. This was not vanity. This was governance. This was rule through illusion. And the irony is heartbreaking, because beneath all the artifice, all the ceremony, all the stubborn perfectionism, there was once a girl who had smiled with real joy, who had laughed freely, who had not yet learned to be afraid of mirrors or the passage of time. That girl had long since been buried under powder and politics. And yet, she was the one Elizabeth was trying to keep alive. In the end, her face was not her own. It belonged to history, to rumor, to propaganda. And she carried it with the determination of someone who knew that the only way to stay in control was to never be seen without it. And when the makeup came off, if it ever did, when the candles were snuffed and the doors closed and the attendants dismissed, what remained was not a queen, but a woman, scarred, tired, fragile, a woman who had outlived every suitor, a woman who had traded vulnerability for power, a woman who had survived, but at what cost? This was the true mask of Elizabeth Tudor, not the one made of white lead and vinegar, but the one made of fear, and if you listen closely, late at night, when the world is quiet and the stars are dim, You might still hear her voice soft. Rewrote, asking her reflection not to betray her, asking her painted face to hold just a little longer, to keep the kingdom together just one more day, because queens don't cry. They conceal, and they endure. Even as the poison sinks in, there are palaces so grand they echo with music, with laughter, with celebration. And then there are palaces like the one Elizabeth Tudor ruled, where silence did not mean peace, and glances held the weight of betrayal. Within the cold, candlelit halls of her court, nothing was ever truly private. Not a word, not a breath, not a lingering look. And behind every velvet curtain, there were eyes, unblinking, loyal to no one but the Queen. To serve Elizabeth was to surrender not just your time or your voice, but your very right to desire. You were permitted to be clever, provided your wit never outshone hers. You were allowed to be beautiful, as long as your beauty was never more admired than hers. And you were permitted to love, but only the Queen. Anything else, any other feeling that bloomed where she could not control it, was suspect. It began slowly, almost invisibly. A hand brushed too close to another. A conversation lingered a moment too long. A laugh. Unguarded. And then, the silence. A shift in the Queen's expression. A summons. A reprimand. A life changed in a single nod. For the ladies in waiting, it was like living on a stage built entirely from secrets. Every day, they dressed in silence, careful not to let their gaze wander. Every meal was eaten under eyes that watched not their forks, but their faces.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Every walk in the gardens, every shared prayer, every gesture was measured. It was not only what you did, it was how long you did it, and who saw you doing it, and how they reported it after you left the room. Because the Queen did not just distrust affection, she observed it like a hawk watches for movement in the grass. She collected evidence of closeness. She remembered names, dates, movements. Her memory was a map of invisible lines. Who sat beside whom? Who handed whom a glove? Who smiled too widely after a dance? And around her, a network of whispers bloomed. Spies were not just agents in cloaks. They were handmaids, pages, tutors, even friends. Elizabeth's court was a web of informants, many of whom never knew their words were being used to feed her suspicions. A quiet remark about someone's laughter might appear, days later, as a question in a private chamber. "What do you think of him?" the Queen might ask, too casually. And suddenly, you were falling, not into love, but into danger. She could be generous. That was the cruelest part. She gave gifts, dresses, jewels, favor, and with them came the illusion of safety, of being in her grace, of being trusted. But grace in Elizabeth's court was never unconditional. It was currency. It was bait. And just when a lady might believe herself untouchable, the Queen would withdraw her warmth with terrifying speed, turning once again into the watcher in the shadows. Some called it jealousy, but jealousy implies a heart that aches. Elizabeth's gaze was colder. She did not envy her ladies for their affections. She simply could not allow love to exist anywhere. She could not rule it. And so the court lived in fear of affection. Even kindness was measured. A gift from one man to a woman was dissected for motive. A poem, if too flattering, might lead to exile. There were no private letters. There were no secret meetings that could stay secret for long. And those who forgot that paid the price. One of the most tragic victims of this quiet tyranny was Lettice Knollys, a noble woman of charm, confidence, and dangerous resemblance, some whispered. She looked like Elizabeth I in her younger years, though none dared say so aloud. Lettice had once moved gracefully within the Queen's orbit, a lady of the chamber, obedient and pleasing. But her crime, her unforgivable trespass, was love. She married Robert Dudley, the Queen's favourite, perhaps more than that. Dudley was no ordinary courtier. He had been beside Elizabeth since the beginning. Their history was tangled with grief, hope, and unspoken promise. He was the man whose presence soothed her rage, whose voice calmed her storms, the one she never married, but never let go. And Lettice took him, not by seduction, not by treachery, but by love. They married in secret, as all forbidden lovers did. And like all secrets in Elizabeth's court, it did not stay hidden for long. The Queen's fury was immediate. She banished Lettice from court for life. There was no appeal, no forgiveness, no softening with time. And when, years later, they saw each other again, Elizabeth slapped her publicly, viciously, without restraint. In that single blow, a decade of silent fury erupted. No court historian wrote about that moment, but it lingered in memory like a bruise beneath powdered skin. And yet Elizabeth did not banish Dudley. Not truly. She punished him. Yes. She withdrew favour. But he returned. Slowly, he returned. Because the Queen could not truly exile the man, she never stopped loving. And so she did something worse. She forgave him but never forgot him. And she erased Lettice. Others suffered not in grand gestures, but in gradual unravelling. Young women who had dared to dream of companionship found themselves slowly isolated, spoken to less, seated farther from the Queen, denied invitations. Their reputations stained not by scandal, but by implication. No one accused them directly. They simply faded. Some broke beneath the pressure. There are stories half lost to time of nervous collapses, of sobbing in locked rooms, of women whispering to walls because they had no one left to trust. Living under watch changed them, made them forget how to feel without fear, made them doubt every glance, until eventually, love itself felt like something shameful, like a risk too great to take. And still, Elizabeth watched, because her court was not only a place of politics and fashion, it was a mirror one she held up to the world to reflect her image. And in that mirror, there could be no rival beauties, no passionate romances, no woman who glowed brighter than she did, because that would mean she was aging. That would mean she was alone. That would mean she had lost something. And Elizabeth Tudor refused to lose. So she built a world where no one could win. A world of stillness, of masks, of rooms where no one said what they felt, and everyone feared what they meant. A court where behind every curtain, love was watched and punished. And as the years went by, and the Queen grew older, and the masks grew thicker, and the silences deeper, the eyes behind the curtains did not close. They multiplied, because fear is contagious, and power, once built on distrust, must always feed itself more suspicion to stay alive. This was not a story of scandal. It was not even a story of cruelty. It was a story of loneliness, magnified, codified, and made law. It was the story of a queen who saw love as a threat, and so buried it under lace and silence and protocol. And in doing so, ensured that no one in her palace would ever dare feel too deeply again. Not even her. There are palaces so grand, they echo with music, with laughter, with celebration. And then there are palaces like the one Elizabeth Tudor ruled, where silence did not mean peace, and glances held the weight of betrayal. Within the cold, candlelit halls of her court, nothing was ever truly private. Not a word, not a breath, not a lingering look. And behind every velvet curtain, there were eyes unblinking, loyal to no one but the Queen. To serve Elizabeth was to surrender not just your time or your voice, but your very right to desire. You were permitted to be clever, provided your wit never outshone hers. You were allowed to be beautiful, as long as your beauty was never more admired than hers. And you were permitted to love, but only the queen. Anything else, any other feeling that bloomed where she could not control it, was suspect. It began slowly, almost invisibly. A hand brushed too close to another. A conversation lingered a moment too long. A laugh, unguarded. And then, the silence, a shift in the queen's expression. A summons, a reprimand, a life changed in a single nod. For the ladies in waiting, it was like living on a stage built entirely from secrets. Every day, they dressed in silence, careful not to let their gaze wander. Every meal was eaten under eyes that watched not their forks, but their faces. Every walk in the gardens, every shared prayer, every gesture was measured. It was not only what you did it was how long you did it, and who saw you doing it, and how they reported it after you left the room. Because the queen did not just distrust affection, she observed it like a hawk watches for movement in the grass. She collected evidence of closeness. She remembered names, dates, movements. Her memory was a map of invisible lines: who sat beside whom, who handed whom a glove, who smiled too widely after a dance. And around her, a network of whispers bloomed. Spies were not just agents in cloaks. They were handmaids, pages, tutors, even friends. Elizabeth's court was a web of informants, many of whom never knew their words were being used to feed her suspicions. A quiet remark about someone's laughter might appear, days later, as a question in a private chamber. "What do you think of him?" the queen might ask, too casually. And suddenly, you were falling, not into love, but into danger. She could be generous. That was the cruelest part. She gave gifts, dresses, jewels, favor, and with them came the illusion of safety, of being in her grace, of being trusted. But grace in Elizabeth's court was never unconditional. It was currency. It was bait. And just when a lady might believe herself untouchable, the queen would withdraw her warmth with terrifying speed, turning once again into the watcher in the shadows. Some called it jealousy, but jealousy implies a heart that aches. Elizabeth's gaze was colder. She did not envy her ladies for their affections. She simply could not allow love to exist anywhere. She could not rule it. And so the court lived in fear of affection. Even kindness was measured. A gift from one man to a woman was dissected for motive. A poem, if too flattering, might lead to exile. There were no private letters. There were no secret meetings that could stay secret for long, and those who forgot that paid the price. One of the most tragic victims of this quiet tyranny was Lettice Knollys, a noble woman of charm, confidence, and dangerous resemblance. Some whispered she looked like Elizabeth I in her younger years, though none dared say so aloud. Lettice had once moved gracefully within the queen's orbit, a lady of the chamber, obedient and pleasing. But her crime, her unforgivable trespass, was love. She married Robert Dudley, the queen's favourite. Perhaps more than that. Dudley was no ordinary courtier. He had been beside Elizabeth since the beginning. Their history was tangled with grief, hope, and unspoken promise. He was the man whose presence soothed her rage, whose voice calmed her storms. The one she never married, but never let go. And Lettice took him, not by seduction, not by treachery, but by love. They married in secret, as all forbidden lovers did, and like all secrets in Elizabeth's court, it did not stay hidden for long. The queen's fury was immediate. She banished Lettice from court for life. There was no appeal. No forgiveness, no softening with time, and when, years later, they saw each other again, Elizabeth slapped her publicly, viciously, without restraint. In that single blow, a decade of silent fury erupted. No court historian wrote about that moment, but it lingered in memory like a bruise beneath powdered skin. And yet Elizabeth did not banish Dudley. Not truly. She punished him. Yes. She withdrew favor, but he returned. Slowly, he returned. Because the Queen could not truly exile the man, she never stopped loving. And so she did something worse. She forgave him but never forgot him. And she erased Lettice. Others suffered not in grand gestures, but in gradual unraveling. Young women who had dared to dream of companionship found themselves slowly isolated, spoken to less, seated farther from the Queen, denied invitations. Their reputations stained not by scandal, but by implication. No one accused them directly. They simply faded. Some broke beneath the pressure. There are stories half lost to time of nervous collapses, of sobbing in locked rooms, of women whispering to walls because they had no one left to trust. Living under watch changed them, made them forget how to feel without fear, made them doubt every glance, until eventually, love itself felt like something shameful, like a risk too great to take. And still, Elizabeth watched, because her court was not only a place of politics and fashion, it was a mirror one she held up to the world to reflect her image. And in that mirror, there could be no rival beauties, no passionate romances, no woman who glowed brighter than she did, because that would mean she was aging. That would mean she was alone. That would mean she had lost something. And Elizabeth Tudor refused to lose. So she built a world where no one could win. A world of stillness, of masks, of rooms where no one said what they felt, and everyone feared what they meant. A court where behind every curtain, love was watched and punished. And as the years went by, and the Queen grew older, and the masks grew thicker, and the silences deeper, the eyes behind the curtains did not close. They multiplied, because fear is contagious, and power, once built on distrust, must always feed itself more suspicion to stay alive. This was not a story of scandal. It was not even a story of cruelty. It was a story of loneliness magnified, codified, and made law. It was the story of a queen who saw love as a threat, and so buried it under lace and silence and protocol, and in doing so, ensured that no one in her palace would ever dare feel too deeply again. Not even her. There was only ever one man who held the Queen's heart, not officially, not in marriage, not in name or ceremony, but in something older and more dangerous than vows. His name was Robert Dudley, and though history will never call him king, in the softest corners of Elizabeth's guarded soul, he reigned in a way no monarch ever could. Their story began long before power had crowned her head or powdered her cheeks. Before the masks, before the laws, before the poisoned silence, they had shared the fragile breath of youth together when her world was not yet cast in iron, when hope still flickered in the uncertain light of a cell in the tower, where both had once been prisoners under suspicion, their lives held by a thread spun from royal cruelty. It was in those early years, in fear and in fire, that something unspoken formed between them. Not kite love, not kite friendship. Something harder to name, and therefore harder to kill. As the years passed and Elizabeth became queen, she kept Robert close, not just in title, but in presence. He was named Master of the Horse, given rooms near hers, always within reach, always watched, always needed. He danced with her, laughed with her, argued with her, And perhaps, in the rarest moments, when no one was looking, he comforted her. There were rumors, always, of secret visits, of shared rooms, of soft words in the shadows. But there was never a wedding, never a ring, never a crown beside hers. Because even as she kept him close, Elizabeth never let herself give in. She was Gloriana, the virgin queen, the body politic, the woman who belonged to no man, and therefore belonged to all of England. To marry was to risk surrendering power, and Elizabeth surrendered nothing, not even her pain. But Robert Dudley was still a man, and even the Queen's favourite grew tired of waiting. Enter Lettice Knollys. She was not a stranger to the Queen. She was family Elizabeth's cousin. Through the Boleyn line, a noblewoman, a widow, a mother, and some whispered a mirror. She had red gold hair, pale skin, a sharp wit that she did not always hide. And when she walked into a room, people noticed, especially Robert. Their affair began quietly. It had to. Robert knew Elizabeth's jealousy. He had tasted it in glances, in silences, in the sudden withdrawal of favour when her moods turned stormy. But love, or perhaps need, will find its cracks. They married in secret in 1578, hoping, perhaps, to manage the Queen's wrath by concealing it until it could no longer be undone. But the Queen was never far from a secret, and when she learned the truth, the fury that followed was not political. It was personal. She had not married Robert, but he had always been hers. And now, without permission, without warning, he belonged to someone else. What happened next was not an execution, not a trial. Elizabeth knew better than to let the world see her fury bleed into statecraft. Instead, she did something quieter and far more devastating. She banished Lettice Knollys from court. Not for a month, not for a year, but forever. No more invitations, no more banquets, no more glimpses of the Queen's gaze. Her name was removed from lists, her place erased from ceremony. She had touched something sacred, Elizabeth's private grief, and the punishment was total exile. But the Queen could not bring herself to banish Robert. She was cold, yes. Distant, yes. He fell from favour, but he returned, slowly, carefully, with the patience of a man who had learned how far he could bend before breaking. Elizabeth took him back, and that was the cruelest thing of all, because it meant she had not stopped needing him, and yet she could never truly forgive him. Years later, when time had settled like dust upon the broken edges of that betrayal, Elizabeth and Lettice saw each other again. It was not a planned reunion, not a formal encounter. The moment arrived like a storm in summer sudden, electric, full of the past. And the Queen, this woman who had faced kings, armies, and death did not speak. She raised her hand, and she struck her cousin across the face. Not with a whip, not with a sword, but with the bare palm of a woman whose wound had never healed. There are no official records of that slap. No courtier dared write it down. But the story passed from mouth to mouth, from chamber to chamber, like a ghost no one could exorcise. And it left behind a silence that lasted years. Because Elizabeth had never married, had never tasted the comfort of being chosen without condition, had never held a child of her own, had never allowed herself to be vulnerable. And Lettice, in one act of love, had taken all of those things, the illusion, the possibility, and made them real with someone Elizabeth once believed belonged only to her. And yet, Lettice lived. She went on to have children, grandchildren. She grew old, not in the palace, but in exile, And in her old age, she still spoke bitterly of the Queen, not in public, but in private rooms, behind safe doors, because some slaps do not bruise the cheek, they bruise the soul. Robert Dudley died in 1588. The Queen wept when she heard the news. She kept the letter he had written her in his final days, folded beside her bed, reading it often, long after he was gone. She never named him as the love of her life, but she never needed to. And when she died, nearly 15 years later, she named no heir in writing. She left no final statement, only silence, because even at the end, she could not let go of control, not of her image, not of her court, not of the love she had never dared claim. And so, the woman who had ruled alone, who had demanded loyalty, who had struck her cousin in a burst of forgotten fury, was buried alone. Her crown passed to another, but her pain remained hers, private, unspoken, etched in the silence of a hand that once trembled, not from fear, but from heartbreak. There are thrones built on swords, and thrones built on blood, and thrones built on gold, but the throne Queen Elizabeth sat upon was built, quietly and deliberately, on something far more invisible and enduring fear. Not the fear of foreign armies or open rebellion, though those came and went like passing storms, but the colder kind, the kind that lingers behind the eyes and coils into prayer. Hers was a reign where faith itself became a performance, and where the soul was no longer private property, it belonged to the crown. In the years following her ascension, Elizabeth I inherited not only the Kingdom of England, but its confusion, its war-torn spirit, its divided God. The scars of her father's break with Rome still bled beneath the surface. Her half-sister Mary had tried to stitch the country back into Catholic obedience with fire and stake and execution, but she had only deepened the wound. So, when Elizabeth stepped forward, the people did not ask for mercy, they asked for certainty. They needed a queen who would end the war of the altar, but Elizabeth did not give them peace. She gave them rules. It was called the Elizabethan religious settlement. But there was nothing settled about it. It was not a compromise. It was not a bridge between beliefs. It was a fortress stone by stone, decree by decree built to protect not God, but order. It allowed people, in theory, to believe what they wished, but only in silence, only behind doors, only where it could not be seen or heard or felt. Because the moment belief stepped into daylight, it became a threat. And in Elizabeth's kingdom, threats were not tolerated. They were rewritten or removed. She made herself Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title carefully chosen to avoid the masculine arrogance of head, but one that still placed her above every priest, every bishop, every whisper of dissent. And from that pulpit of power, she preached not salvation, but sameness. Conformity was the gospel. Uniformity. The ritual, not of the heart, of the body. You had to be seen obeying, even if your soul flinched at every word. Church attendance became mandatory, not as a spiritual offering, but as a demonstration of loyalty. Services had to follow the Book of Common Prayer, line for line, gesture for gesture. The sacraments were scripted, the hymns regulated. Even silence was watched, because silence, too, could betray you if it was not performed correctly. The wrong pause, the wrong look, the absence of visible devotion could speak louder than any heresy. And what of those who could not, would not bend? They paid. Not with blood, not at first, but with everything else. Catholics who refused to attend the Anglican services were fined heavily, again and again, until homes were sold livelihoods lost, families broken. Their children watched as sacred statues were smashed. As priests disappeared, as the world shrunk into something grey and silent, and those children learned to speak carefully, to pray without moving their lips, to mistrust even the walls of their own houses. But it was not only Catholics who felt the shadow of the Queen's church. The Puritans, too, trembled beneath her stare. They wanted more reform, more fire, more purity. But Elizabeth saw them not as allies, but as agitators. It was not their beliefs. She feared it was their independence. She saw what they would not say, that anyone who thought the church needed purging might one day think the same of the Queen. So she silenced them. With fines, with exile, with the quiet opening of prison doors that never closed again. And still, she watched. Because it was not enough for Elizabeth to declare her version of God. She needed proof that everyone else had done the same. She built a nation of informants. Parish priests became her eyes. Neighbours turned into spies. Servants whispered what they overheard at night. Children were taught to listen, to report, to judge. A prayer said in Latin. A candle lit at the wrong hour. A missing family on a Sunday morning. All could be suspicion. All could become accusation. In this church she built. The body knelt because it had to. The mouth sang because silence was suspicious. And the heart, well, the heart learned how to hide. It learned how to bow without believing, how to pretend. And Elizabeth approved, because she did not want their faith. She wanted their obedience. Her doctrine was not built on mercy or miracle, but on surveillance. And the greatest miracle of all was how quickly people adapted, how quickly they stopped asking questions, how quickly the sound of a bell ringing no longer meant God was present, but that the Queen was listening. Over 200 Catholics were executed during Elizabeth's reign, but she never called them martyrs. She never called it persecution. She called it treason, because in her court, belief was not punished for being wrong, it was punished for being dangerous, for being disloyal, for daring to place any authority higher than her own. And the people learned to cross themselves only in private, to keep their rosaries hidden, to erase old prayers from their minds. They learned that safety did not come from God. It came from silence. The Queen's own beliefs were a mystery. She rarely spoke of personal devotion. She did not weep publicly. She did not pray in view of others. She wore her faith like she wore her crown, perfectly positioned, rigidly still, and always polished. But behind that image, there must have been a question. One she never asked aloud. Did anyone believe anymore? Or had they simply learned to look like they did? And perhaps, in the deepest moments of her solitude, she wondered, was she still a queen of souls? Or only of bodies? Were the people hers in spirit? Or merely in posture? Had she built a church? Or a stage? And if it was only a stage, how long could the performance last? But she never asked. Never softened. Never loosened the grip. Because to admit uncertainty would be to admit doubt. And doubt, in Elizabeth's England, was a crack in the crown. So she held it tight. And the people bowed. And the bells rang. And God, whoever he was, watched in silence. She once dazzled like a flame. Her red hair, the colour of firelight against cold stone, braided into towering coils. Her gowns heavy with pearls. Her fingers glittering with rings. Her every step echoing with command. She was not born to be invisible. She was born to be seen. And yet, as the years passed, and the shadows stretched longer across the palace floors, Queen Elizabeth I began to vanish slowly, quietly beneath the very image she had built. No one could say exactly when the change began. Perhaps it was after Dudley died. Or perhaps it was when the music in the great halls began to sound more like memory than celebration. Or maybe it was simply age, an enemy she had never prepared to meet face to face. She had defied so many things: assassination, invasion, rebellion, loneliness. But time, unrelenting and unimpressed by power, came anyway. And when it did, the Queen responded, as she always had, with control. Even as her joints stiffened, her eyesight faded, her strength waned. Elizabeth clung harder to the illusion. Each day became a ritual of resistance, not against her enemies, but against her own reflection. By then, the poison was already deep. The white lead she had used since her youth, the same mixture that had once concealed her smallpox scars, had burrowed beneath her skin like regret. It had stripped her pores, discolored her flesh, burned tiny fissures into her face. Her cheeks, once full and fair, had grown hollow and brittle. Her skin no longer felt like skin. It was parchment, powdery and peeling beneath layers of paste. But still, she wore it. Every morning, she endured it. The scraping, the dabbing, the painting of a mask that had once protected her from scrutiny, but had become a prison of her own making. Her attendants applied it in silence. None dared flinch.
I must protect
None
my
dared
throne.
pause. They knew what she feared more than
But
death
what of
being
our
seen.
love?
And beneath the crown, her hair was gone. Not thinned, gone. The lead had taken it slowly. First in patches, then in clumps, until even the finest wigs could not conceal the bare truth beneath. So, she amassed a collection, hundreds of wigs, some auburn, some ash blonde, some curled in elaborate Tudor twists. And every day, a new crown of hair was chosen, not as ornament, but as armor. The real scalp underneath was never to be exposed. It was her final secret. But there were others. Her teeth, those once praised in poetry, had blackened, rotted, fallen. Some said the stench of her breath, sweetened by crushed pearls and cloves, could not mask the decay. Her jaw had begun to sink inward. Her face, when unpadded, had become angular and spectral. So, she stuffed cloth into her cheeks. She held her mouth in strange, forced expressions, and to the world, she smiled. At court, the illusion remained law. No one was permitted to comment on the changes, not on her appearance, not on her health, not even on her weariness. The Queen was eternal, and to suggest otherwise was treason by implication. Even as she leaned harder on her cushions, even as her speeches shortened, even as she walked less, and rested more, and fell into long silences by the fire. When ambassadors came, she summoned the strength to appear. She rose, powdered and gloved, draped in jewels, but her hands trembled beneath lace. Her lips cracked beneath rouge, and behind her eyes was the desperate glint of someone performing a role she no longer had the strength to play. Still, she refused to relinquish the stage. She continued to hold counsel, continued to sign letters, continued to pose for portraits, carefully orchestrated illusions in which her waist remained slim, her gaze piercing, her figure timeless. The painters, trained in flattery, followed her face patterns like scripture. No wrinkle was captured, no fatigue recorded. Her image, once a reflection, had become myth. But those closest to her knew. They saw her wince when she stood. They heard the rasp in her voice. They carried her secret between themselves like a dying ember. And though they never said it aloud, they began to prepare for the end. She did not. Elizabeth, who had planned every aspect of her reign, refused to plan for her death. She named no successor. She left no instructions. To speak of her mortality was to summon it. To prepare for its arrival was to accept defeat. And so, she banished the thought as she had banished rivals, lovers, and pain. But the body cannot be silenced forever. In the final months of her life, the queen grew thinner, paler. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She refused to go to bed at all. Sitting upright in her chamber, draped in layers of cloth, her wig still affixed, her face still painted, as if death would not find her if she simply refused to lie down. She sat for hours in silence. Then days. Her ladies begged her to rest. She would not. Her mind remained sharp. But her body betrayed her. Her speech slurred. Her limbs grew cold. She stopped speaking. She stopped blinking. But still, she did not ask for a priest. Still, she did not whisper regrets. She did not cry. Queens do not cry.
I must protect
When she could no longer speak, she communicated only with her eyes. And when even that became too much, she slipped into stillness. Not peace, stillness. And when the moment finally came, when her breath ceased, and the long, elaborate lie unraveled into still air, the palace did not wail. It did not announce. It did not dare break the quiet. Because what had just died was not merely a monarch. It was a performance that had lasted 45 years. And the mask, white, perfect, uncracked, remained on her face until the last attendant turned away. They buried her, as she had lived unquestioned. Untouchable. Unresolved. They placed her beneath Westminster Abbey, wrapped in royal cloth, beside her half-sister Mary, the woman she had imprisoned in life and now rested beside in death. There was no child to mourn her, no king to follow her, only a country, exhaling the breath it had held for nearly half a century, and a memory powdered, perfumed, and poisoned. The woman beneath the crown had vanished long ago. All that remained was the myth, and myths, unlike queens, do not rot. Power, once tasted, is a flavour that lingers long after the feast. And for Elizabeth Tudor, it was not simply a right or a role, it was survival. Her entire life had been an act of possession, of holding on to her body, to her image, to her kingdom, to her version of the truth. And so, even as her body failed, and the crown grew heavier with each passing day, there was one thing she refused to let go of. One silence she held longer than all the rest. She would not name an heir. For over 4 decades, she had ruled alone. Not as wife, not as mother, not as half of any whole. Hers was a reign defined by singularity. She was the sun, and the court revolved around her, not because they had no choice, but because she gave them no alternative. And like any sun, she knew that naming a dawn was the beginning of dusk. To name a successor was to admit that the end was coming. To choose another was to acknowledge her own absence. And Elizabeth did not know how to be absent. She had survived so much execution orders, imprisonments,
Now
invasions,
that the lights have dimmed
betrayals.
and the palace
But
has
it was this
fallen
final,
quiet.
invisible adversary that brought her to the edge. The knowledge that one day England would belong to someone else. That the rooms where her voice once echoed would ring with another's words. That the hands which held the scepter would no longer be hers. And so, she said nothing. Not when her counsellors begged her. Not when Parliament pressed her. Not when her closest advisers, grey-haired and weary, warned that the kingdom would fall into chaos if no successor was named. She listened. She nodded. But she answered with silence. Even when they spoke of James of Scotland, James, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had once signed into death. After decades of fear and rivalry and letters soaked in blood, James, the child born of a Queen Elizabeth, had both pitied and destroyed. James, the boy raised beyond her reach, educated in her shadow, watching England from across the border like a hungry heir, waiting for the candle to go out. He was the obvious choice. Protestant, male, educated, of royal blood, and still, Elizabeth said nothing. Not a letter, not a word, not a single sentence written in her own hand that would serve as confirmation, because to name him was to finish her sentence, to close the chapter, to become history before she had even died. And Elizabeth was not finished being alive. So, the kingdom waited, year after year, and as she aged, the waiting turned to worry, because England, without a named heir, was a throne on the edge of fire. Civil war was not a possibility. It was a certainty, one whisper away. The nobles knew it. The people knew it. The foreign powers circling like vultures above her court knew it. Without a voice from the Queen herself, there would be no peace. But Elizabeth held fast. Even as her health faltered, even as her nights grew longer, and the cold in her bones grew heavier, she refused to speak the name. There are stories soft and strange of the last weeks of her life, how she sat for days in silence, refusing food, refusing warmth, refusing even the soft bed laid out for her, how she remained upright, draped in blankets, unmoving, unmoved, as if surrendering to comfort would be a kind of betrayal. How her ladies watched helplessly as she wasted away not with drama, but with the slow, maddening dignity of someone who refused to let death feel triumphant. And still, the question remained, who will rule after you? It hung in the air like the scent of decay. Some say she whispered it. At the very end, that, when the Archbishop of Canterbury knelt beside her, asking if James should be king, she lifted a trembling hand in vague assent. A flick of the fingers, an ambiguous gesture. Nothing more. But it was enough, or it had to be, because the kingdom needed something to hold on to. And so, James was crowned. But no official proclamation bore Elizabeth's name. No signature. No seal, because even in death, she had clung to her silence. She had ruled a nation without ever sharing her power, and in the end, she died the same way she had lived alone at the top, refusing to bend, her lips sealed against the future. It was not indecision that kept her silent. It was fear, not of James, not of civil war, but of being forgotten. To name a successor was to create a tomorrow she would not be part of. It was to invite the world to look beyond her. And Elizabeth had spent a lifetime making sure no one ever did. She knew that once the heir was named, the court would shift. The letters would change direction. The ambassadors would bow differently. Her shadow would shrink. And so she chose denial over legacy. Because legacy was not enough. She wanted presence. She wanted permanence. But time is not kind to queens who refuse to die. And though her silence kept the future at bay for a while, it could not hold forever. When she was finally gone, and the bells tolled across England, there was sorrow. Yes, but there was also relief, a kind of quiet, shameful exhale. The kingdom could breathe again, not because they had hated her, but because her refusal to release the throne had trapped them all in a palace of suspense. And as James rode south from Scotland, crossing rivers and villages and fields she had once called her own, England tilted gently, imperceptibly into a new reign. Her name was still spoken. Her portrait still hung. Her laws still stood. But something had changed, because power, once surrendered, cannot be taken back. And Elizabeth had surrendered nothing. Not her crown, not her love, Not even the future. Only silence. Always silence. And now, with the court gathered, and the black cloth drawn, and the white lead finally washed from her skin, the woman who had ruled without yielding was finally still. But even then, her absence echoed louder than most voices. Because when a queen refuses to name the one who comes after, she is not just withholding a name, she is refusing to die. Now that the lights have dimmed, and the palace has fallen quiet, and the perfume of ceremony has faded into the cold stone of Westminster, we are left not with the image, but with the outline. The crown rests on another's head. The throne sits occupied. The days move forward, as they always do. But somewhere, deep beneath the skin of history, she remains. Elizabeth, the queen who chose silence over love, the girl who watched her mother die before she learned to speak in full sentences, the teenager who survived suspicion with poise and ink-stained restraint, the woman who, once handed the scepter, clutched it so tightly that she never opened her hands again, not even to hold the ones who loved her. And perhaps, in the quiet, you wonder, was she cruel, or was she afraid? Was she arrogant, or simply wounded? Was her refusal to name an heir, to marry, to soften, a mark of selfishness or of survival? Because the truth, like most truths worth losing sleep over, is not sharp. It does not pierce. It lingers. It whispers from the folds of velvet and the cracks in gold leaf. It asks questions no history book wants to answer. What does it cost to hold power with both hands and never let it go? What does it take to become a myth and never again a woman? She gave England everything except the parts of herself she had already lost. She offered her body only as a symbol, never as a companion. She gave her name, but never her touch. She offered her image, again and again, revised and repainted and rehearsed. But she never once let the world see her bruises. Even her voice so clear, so commanding was rationed carefully, shaped like a dagger, wrapped in poetry, always revealing just enough to rule, but never enough to be known. And still, they loved her. The people, the poets, the sailors, the ministers. They wrote sonnets. They named ships after her. They called her Gloriana, Estrella, the fairy queen. But they never called her by the name she might have wanted in the dark. Not daughter, not wife, not mother, not beloved, just Majesté, always Majesté. And though it may sound strange, there is something unspeakably human in that. Because haven't we all, in some way, built armor around the softest parts of ourselves? Haven't we all learned, from pain or betrayal or fear, that the safest way to be adored is from a distance? Haven't we all, at some point, chosen silence because we didn't know how to speak without breaking? Elizabeth simply did it better than most. She turned her walls into palaces, her boundaries into law, her pain into policy, and the world, starved for strength and dazzled by elegance, applauded her for it. But when the court finally went dark, and the musicians stopped playing, and the last of the attendants closed her chamber doors, she was alone, not just physically, but cosmically, because she had ruled over hearts without ever giving hers away. And now, in the hush of history's long night, we must ask, was it worth it to die undefeated, but untouched, to leave behind no heir, but endless portraiture, to be remembered not for your love, but for your refusal to need it? Perhaps she would say yes. Perhaps that was the only answer she ever trusted. And yet, perhaps not. Because somewhere between the powdered face and the poisoned skin, between the slap that echoed across time and the bed she refused to lie in, between the letter she kept from Dudley and the heir she never named, there is a pause, a hesitation, a heartbeat, and in that space, maybe even for a moment, Elizabeth Tudor remembered the girl she had been before the throne, before the mask, before silence became her language, and maybe, in that memory, she grieved, not for her reign, but for herself. So now, as the story ends, as your eyes grow heavy and the night folds around you, let us not only remember the queen who ruled a golden age, but the woman who taught the world that silence can be a crown. And that love, when caged too long, forgets how to knock. Let us remember that power can preserve you, but it cannot warm you. That perfection may win obedience, but never companionship. And that sometimes, the loudest legacy is not what a ruler did, but what she never said. Sleep now. Gloriana, your court is still, your crown is quiet, and your silence finally can rest.